what perhaps our colonial mechanisms have inflicted on countries, the possibilities they have deprived them of. And then we come with money or whatever, or with our technology, and without asking questions whether they are the right thing in that place. And so I thought that was not right. And when I, with friends, created that little non-profit, we deliberately stood out of all the mechanisms of conventional development aid, because I think they are just not, it's not all bad, but I think it's not the best way of organizing the relationships. But to come back to also why we need to really, as scientists, as researchers, as citizens, as on the planet, as steward of the planet, because let's not forget, we are living in the Anthropocene, no matter how the geologists fight it out in their different schools of thought, but we are now in every last quarter of the planet. We influence that. And you have read the news about the West Antarctic shelf ice, etc., etc. I mean, we're just everywhere. And so I was struck by a paper I found in Nature by some colleagues who had tried to do mass balance assessment for the whole world, and they figured that the living matter is now less than the artifacts human societies have produced. So, that sort of makes you sit up and think, is that really what we want to have? And can we, after all, we know something about entropy, and can we really replace nature? Can we live with that on the long run? So then that, because my background is in fisheries, I was also looking at some global overviews about what industrial fisheries do. And thankfully, it's very hard to monitor the oceans, but since there are now a lot of, let's say, satellites up there, and then this NGO, Global Fishing Watch, with top IT people, figured, well, the big vessels are all obliged to have AIS signals, that is automatic identification signals, to avoid collisions. But that means also you can know wherever they are, and if you track them, you can know whether they go fast or slow. If they go slow and there's a fishing vessel, the suspicion is that they are fishing and not steaming, etc., etc. And also the way the pattern that they give, or when they go dark, reaching a theoretically protected zone, you say, what happens when they emerge 3 days later and they have fixed the technical problem and issue their signals again? No? So, and if you look, the yellow ones is trawling, so it is most extensive all around the European coast, a little bit of West Africa, and then around China, and a little bit on the extensive shelf in Argentina, much less in other parts of the world. And the other signals are long lining, and long lining is also a very, very impactful technology. That it's like kilometers and kilometers of baited hooks that are being set out, and they catch everything, really. Of course, including sharks that should be protected, etc., etc. So, but it means, if you look at that, it means really the global fisheries, the industrial fisheries, are everywhere. And so when you look back, you know, in the past, like less than 100 years ago, 70, 80 years ago, the fishermen were small, short, and you know, slim. The fish were big, and now it's the opposite. It's the other way around. And that, in the face of all these, the evidence that fantastic scientists from all over the world have produced, and starting with the Club of Rome, or the equivalent that also from Argentina, which also took into account social matters, or the IPCC reports, which were unequivocal since 2013, that it's the humans that make the difference, or the biodiversity IPBES report, recently the water conference, and then the UN conferences, which are more political conferences than science, but you know, there's a lot of science that is also presented there. So there's no shortage of, what I'm trying to say is there is no shortage of scientific evidence, yet we find it very hard to bring about the change that we need in our production consumption patterns, so that would act on what we know. So, of course, we are not the first ones being in social movements or trying to reach out and engage with citizens and encourage mobilization and interest and engagement. So there is progress, I would say, and I think one of the most encouraging, or there's a series of encouraging agreements that have been struck over the last year, I would say. The first is the under the Convention of Biodiversity, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Then under the Law of the Sea, shortly, that was agreed, the Kunming was agreed in December in Montreal. And under the Law of the Sea, there was a long-standing negotiation process on and off, because it touches on many sensitive issues, but they had a mandate to negotiate an agreement to ensure the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. Why that? Because coastal zones, in most countries, to 12 miles, nautical miles from the low waters tide mark, are national waters. Then you have, since the Law of the Sea, when it entered into force in 1994, almost all countries declared exclusive economic zones 200 miles out. But everything beyond that was basically lawless, with a few exceptions where there were regional fisheries organizations with a limited mandate. But basically, it was like Wild West, anything goes. So it was very important to close that legal gap with the BBNG treaty. And what they agreed in both biodiversity treaties or related treaties is to protect at least 30% of the terrestrial areas and the sea by 2030. So this is why we often talk about 30 by 30. And of course, it may be easier to declare on the high seas, where basically it's about 8 countries who catch most of what the resources, at least the living resources of the high seas are. Everybody else doesn't have the technology to do it like this. So it is relatively easy to declare huge areas, but recent assessment also suggests that most of them are paper parks. so only about between 1% and 2% of the sea beyond the more than 10% that are now declared, but less than 2% are fully protected. Another important agreement was this WTO agreement to phase out, after 20 years, more than 20 years of stalling, to phase out the harmful subsidies, because all the economic analysis suggests that if those fleets were not subsidized, they would not be economically viable. So we were very keen to push that, and we're part of a big alliance to promote that. Now, if you see, perhaps some of you may have seen the planetary boundaries. This is the last paper by Richardson and almost 20 co-authors. And you can see that the genetic and biodiversity issue is the one that is most under, is really the most dramatically overexploited. We have mass extinction now. We have, is estimated at more than 1,000 times background extinction levels. So that means a lot of the genes that allow development and adaptation to changing conditions have simply been lost and already. And we are struggling very often with quite inadequate means, very expensive, but not very successful to protect more species. So what do we, so we have this hope, but that means we have this global agreement. For more than 10 years, the lawyers, the politicians, the lobbyists, everybody have been sitting different configurations and struck that deal. Now, they have taken a lot of time. That means they could get to know each other, build some trust, etc. But the lawyers and the politicians, very often, they know each other in different countries, but they are very poorly connected to the realities in their countries very often, because they are privileged people. They do a good job. I'm not criticizing, but we have huge difficulties in translating those global agreements then into practical application. So the first effort now is to ratify and prepare everything for implementation, because it means institutional adjustments and what have you. We also I think we need to be very careful about, let's say, the techno believers who head on fall for the next technology. Now it's AI, before it was something else. And you know, it's always sold as if it would now solve all our problems. But what we find is that none of the technologies that have been put forward over the last 50 years have led to a reduced material flow and reduced energy consumption. It's always more, because whatever inefficiency we gain, we lose, because then more people use it, more people, whatever. No, or we have now these farms the IT farms to feed the clouds, etc. I mean, this is a tremendous amount of energy that is being utilized. And I think the third thing is fair transitions, which means, you know, it is not really acceptable that a rich country declare that, oh, we're going to do this and that, and the way they do it is really delocation of the dirty industries or of the mineral exploitation or other things in countries with weaker jurisdictions. So we have the illusion we reduce our CO2 emissions, etc. But in fact, we have only displaced them, and we have perhaps contributed unwittingly, more or less, that other people don't have those same opportunities, or increasingly they live in areas in the world where, because of heat waves and this and that, you can simply not live anymore there. So now, if I focus on the ocean, where would we like to look forward to in the future is certainly low impact fisheries. So it's do away with all these fuel guzzling long distance fleets. We know that small scale fishers, for example, have the same production as the global industrial fleet. You know, they're being told, at least the not the entire industrial fleet, but the trawl fleet, the bottom trawl fleet has the same production globally as the small scale fishers. But the small scale fishers are about 120 million, and then lots of more people in the value chain, and it's close to home, etc., etc. And they simply don't have the same technology and have less impactful ways of using the ocean or the fresh waters. In this context, it's very important to have on the mental map the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication. These, contrary to these biodiversity agreements, which I mentioned, have been developed bottom-up. There were 3 years of negotiations, consultations, in all continents, with fishing groups, with conservation groups, etc., etc. And it was presented and adopted, but as voluntary directives, voluntary guidelines in the FAO Committee of Fisheries, which is one of the platforms where officialdom in fisheries meets every 2 years to give the orientations of where do we want to go, etc. Then the question is, of course, can we drive policy change in all the countries so that those guidelines, which are based on human rights, gender equality, protecting the natural environment, and the livelihoods of those small people, can we really translate that into practice in all the countries? If I look, yes, this is not, don't try to read everything. These are the Sustainable Development Goals according to the last this year is the midterm, right? They were adopted in 2015, and the agenda runs to 2030. And you see the green ones were the voluntary commitments of countries in the beginning, and even in the beginning already, the violet ones, the bluish ones, were not even by any stretch of imagination reaching into what they had politically agreed. And now at midterm, you can see that quite a number are actually rolling back instead of going forward. None of the objectives is, I think one objective, the one objective, let's say there are 17 goals, and then they are broken down by indicators and so on to targets. And I think the only target that is on track is internet penetration and access to internet. But none of the food, the health, the gender equity. Gender equity, they have estimated that it takes another 300 years before, with the measures in place, before we get gender equity. Right. So basically what we see, we have the challenge of the implementation gap, right? And I took the upper picture is from a picture database. So how do they present? What is agreement for them? So it's two males shaking hands over a map of, in this case, Europe and Asia and a bit of Africa, right? So, you know, what does it mean? It is, in a way, emblematic. This is, to some extent, I don't want to criticize it altogether, but just to make sure that it's only part of the deal, right? This is representing, if you wish, the international, the global negotiations. But the ground reality is depicted in the picture below. This is in Senegal, in Han. And, you know, the pirogues come in and the women want expecting them and trying to get some fish, and it's not clean, it's not well entertained, etc., etc. Yeah. So what I would like to do in the, perhaps because time is flying, right? I would like to show you a little picture just to take you now on a little journey of what we're trying to do in terms of listening to people. When we try to work with those communities, we're not going there and trying to tell them, oh, why don't you do this, that, and the other. We first go there and listen to what is important for them, because that can be quite different to our perceptions of what is priority. To do that, we have, and also to honor the enormous knowledge and the experience people in small-scale fisheries have. We have called it, after consultation across all of Senegal, with people from all regions, all age groups, men, women, from all professions. We launched together with them what we call the Small-Scale Fisheries Academy. And I wanted to show you, now let me see. What do I get? Media. You have it.
Is this slide here or?
No, yeah, but there is a video underneath. Yeah. If you look for that video, yeah, that would be fantastic. Because I don't know whether it.
I just forgot that the online people didn't see you.
There is an extra video so that you don't have to rely on
this.
Yes, I think it should be that.
Blue justice and responsive governance require the empowerment of men and women in small-scale fishery for individual and collective action.
I am Nadia. The Academy taught us a lot of things. We learned how to manage our life, how to avoid the waste of income. I can say that it has motivated me to work more and look for solutions to improve my income.
Just like Nadia, many other workers involved in fisheries have become members of the Academy. Everyone is welcome. This initiative engages fishermen, women in fishing, processing and marketing, wholesalers, retailers, social regulatory bodies, and connected professions, including administrators and scientists. The Small-Scale Fisheries Academy is a safe, multi-actor platform for respectful dialogue, joint learning, co-creation of knowledge, and innovation for the recovery, protection, and sustainable use of marine and coastal resources and prosperous artisanal fisheries. Small-Scale Fisheries Academy provides operational support for the implementation of the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries. All of the Academy's activities start with a visioning exercise. Vision inspires and guides planning. Without a clear vision, it is difficult to imagine where you're going, and it is easy to become discouraged by the challenges that will arise along the way. Nabia, to the right, is explaining a collective drawing, exposing what constitutes a happy life for her microfishmonger group. Nabia started visioning herself in 1 year's time, selling 6 crates of fish per week and being the owner of a motorbike to make the transportation of her products easier. Before her participation in the training, she could only market 1 fish crate per week. Following the plan she grew, in the first 3 months, she reduced her expenses for new clothes and phone credit, which allows her to buy more fish and market 2 crates a week.
Yeah, she was really low on the ladder, in social ladder.
Challenges, she has been able to carry on with her business, opting to diversify her products, now including dried fish. After 1 year, she has been able to use some of her profit to improve her house's rooftop. The inclusive visual exercises support the exploration of individual and collective pathways for change.
So you don't need to write.
Recognizing their knowledge and experiences, the process brings to light taboo topics and enables the identification of opportunities for improvement of life and working conditions. It promotes catalyzing energies for tangible changes towards gender and social justice. The Academy promotes respectful dialogue between different actors in the value chain in small-scale fisheries.
We learned a lot of things at the Academy. We hope, by the grace of God, to make use of it to the benefit of our families. Inshallah.
Yeah. So, in fact, Nabia was one of the people who, even when we went into COVID, she just stuck it out and did apply what she had learned, and she was very successful. So, in fact, she is now becoming a leader. She was absolutely low in the pecking order. So she, as a micro, she could just handle 1 crate per week. There are others who handle a ton per week, just to get the relationship. But because she was, just determined and she pulled through, not only did she repair her house and everything, we'll get there. She now runs even a restaurant and a shop, and she has become the go-to person. That is what you want. We don't want to be there all the time in terms of, what we would like to see is that people take their fate into their own hands, be organized, and just move forward. Yeah, so, and that just to some more.
Next slide.
Yeah, next slide. That was just some impressions from the launch of the Academy. And really, it was amazing. The fisheries director was impressed because we had people from all over the country. I think the fisheries department never had anything as inclusive as that. And then how does it work? You have seen already, no? We start always with this visioning exercise, and it's what they envision, not what we envision. And it's basically, when you are, let's say, with a limited horizon, what do you want? Do you want a roof over your head? Do you want to be able to eat, to be able to work, have health care and education for the kids? That is in different variations. That is always what they want. So nothing extraordinary, but just a decent living. And then this inviting them to structure their work. Now, what we found, and that is perhaps interesting, is, all these people live very much in the informal economy. They have very little control over the external conditions. Sometimes the women wait for hours because even now with mobile phones, it's not always for granted that the boats will tell them when they come. So the productivity is low in a way. There are ways in which they could make better use and have more quality of life. That sort of things. But because they are always, or not always, but often in a reactive mode, doing a bit of planning and a step back and say, okay, what could I encounter in terms of enabling conditions, or where are the obstacles? Do I have allies? Can my neighbors help me overcome this? That sort of thing. Think about it so that when whatever arrives, you are prepared and off you go, and it doesn't knock you over. So, and we did it all visually because most of the people have not been able to go to school. So, in fact, the people who came to join the academy said that they had never owned a booklet with and pens to write into the booklet. And so it made them very proud, actually. And it also allows you, if you keep it, we insist very much that they keep their booklets so that they are in control, because then you can see, have I made progress, or no, perhaps I need to readjust my targets because I've run up against, well, there is a fantastic opportunity, I need to go for it, right? Yeah. And in fact, this way of organizing what we said is respectful dialogue is that allowed us even to touch very delicate issues like gender equity. When times are going tough, as they are at the moment, we know there's a lot of violence, for example, in the families. Not because people are inherently bad or anything, but it's just crowded conditions, perhaps failure to bring back fish, and all kinds of things. And so we created a condition where first the women on one side and then the men in another could reflect during workshop, how would they like to organize their living conditions. And we used this image of the tree. If you want a tree that produces lots of fruit, you want a strong tree with strong, rooting, and the tree must also be stable, let's say. If all the fruits are only on one side, the tree may topple over, right? So, in other words, also decision-making and how you make use of resources in the family, you are better off if people have a say, and if you have a conflict, you solve it with words and not with your fist, sort of thing. And it was, you need to be very, very careful because these are intimate things, right? When it's not to be pushy or anything, but it was very encouraging to see that at the end of that workshop, even the men, even though they were less forthcoming than the women, but they said, it's better to solve problems in different ways. And same thing with the value chain. Let's say it's not the same thing everywhere in Africa. Of course, Africa is a huge continent, so many different places, cultures, languages, you name it. But in the fishery, what we observe very often is that men and women have separate accounts to some extent, and there is a certain division of labor. There are women that go fishing, is about 10% roughly globally, is according to lots of case studies. But very often it's the men going out to fish, and the women expect them on the beach and buy the fish. And then they process and sell the fish. In the past, when fishing was good and not as much industrial fishing around, the women would actually pre-finance some of the fishing trips, and they had privileged access to the catch. And they would not pay on the beach, not pay cash, but they would get the fish, process it, and then sell it and pay the fishers upon sale. So that meant also that more money was fed back into the family and into the children. Now, with catches being very, very bad, in Senegal and Mauritania down to Guinea-Conakry, with all these fish meal plants from Korea, China, Spain, and so on, that are mostly fed from the industrial fleets, but not only. So the fishers now say, okay, if you don't pay cash, we go to the fish meal plant. And that means if the women don't earn money, then the kids don't eat, or you cannot pay for school fees, or things like that. So, and it is an indication that the times are getting really rough, and it also means a lot of the, in none of these countries really have a very well developed social system with pensions or health care, etc., etc. So it's mostly through neighborhood that problems get dealt with. But if the resources are getting scarce, then the solidarity is also wearing thin. But should I?
No, just
what I only wanted to say for the value chains, is that because the women most of the time have no idea how it is on board the vessels, and vice versa. The men don't bother too much in fish processing, except when they are laborers, but then they don't call the shots. They are just employees. When we did these exercises about value chains, it meant that people were discussing not in general terms, but very specifically, okay, how are we organized? Can we negotiate our deals slightly different, that there is more benefit on all sides? And, things like that, how you can improve things. Yes, and of course, COVID came and we had to interrupt, but the people who had been in the first classes actually kept on meeting. And even though we had to cancel even some planned workshops, but they, because of the trust they had built through the earlier trainings, they were already trying to apply some of the things they had learned. And when we then, a bit later, we could pick up again and to assess, have you managed? We need to do a new planning, etc., etc. So it was good to meet them again. Now, a lot of disasters have struck since. For example, when I stay in Senegal, the government has recently sold additional industrial licenses to foreign vessels, even though the resources are very badly overfished. And that is really a disaster. And also, for example, the gas exploration and exploitation now in Mauritania, and this let's say is in areas which used to be good fishing grounds for the small-scale fleet, and they cannot go anymore. So the whole social fabric is collapsing. We have heard now that women go into prostitution and all kinds of things. The men go further and further afield, trying to find fish, risking lives. And what you have probably heard in the news, more and more people just don't see a future anymore. And when you had boat people from Senegal, Mauritania, Guinea, etc., it was usually not the fishers because they were better off than the agricultural people. But now they are living in droves, and they go to the Canary Islands, and friends tell them, in El Hierro, in one day, 1,000 people arrived. It's tough now. So it is so important that people improve their organization individually, but even more so collectively. And what we can see that even though we have been able to do much less recently because of COVID and so on, they are applying what they have learned in different areas, including now in a local NGO that goes for kid education. Cœur Magou. Cœur is she is like Magou is the name of the NGO, and Cœur is we are at Magou, and they are trying to diversify and do something for the. Yeah, so oh gosh, time is flying. And really for us is what I'm trying to convey is that what we do is far from perfect, right? And it is at a small scale. But we think it's the citizens that are impact experts. They know what the state measures will mean for their lives. So we think they need to be listened to. We are encouraging experimental spaces where we try out how it could work differently. Because we know when you remember the first slide I showed about the biomass versus artifacts on Earth, there is something we need to do. But we are organized in certain ways, right? So it's not so easy to stray from there. And you cannot just push a button and everything goes differently. You need time to experiment, to try out. Some things will work in one place, but not in another. So we need those spaces to try out and gain experience and see, and also learn what of the measures can travel and work in not only in one village, but in many villages, and what needs to be very deeply rooted in local culture, etc., etc. And that, I think, the most precious thing in this context is because no individual measure will be enough, but every measure counts. It is very important, even for small things, that we learn that and then we scale it up, or we collaborate with others, and then together we achieve more. And that means also to accept that, there are many ways in being happy, and to accept that otherness can also be okay, that we can learn from that we don't want to reinstate these colonial subordinate relationships somehow, because actually it destroys so many talents, and we need all talents now. And so we need for fairness and equity, because then we can really mobilize the fantastic capacity that is hidden in everybody, and bring them out and to flourish. Right. So I think I stop here. All I want to show you is perhaps a couple of other things. Just fly through a couple of pictures to say, because it's not only the science, it's the arts, it's the local culture, and we do work with local artists, for example, who work in schools. Then every time for World Ocean Day or in other occasions, we encourage environmental awareness. Here, for example, in the middle picture is we had developed years ago for the FAO a teaching aid for ecosystem approach to fisheries. And how do you measure the fish here? Well, I don't know, most of you are not Dutch, but I brought some Dutch things. And it's a campaign, let the babies grow, right? Let them grow to adulthood, because then you cannot destroy the stocks. It may not be optimal, but there will be future. So we had these meters, and the kids did a school outing to the beach, and they were measuring the fish. And many fish were okay, but this one, for example, which you see there, should have been twice as big. So they were catching babies. That means you're destroying your own future, right? And and also diversifying education that is not so hierarchical and so harsh sometimes. So the kids like it quite a lot. Then we do beach cleanups, say, with partners here, and this is a case from Cameroon. Or we had an agreement with a youth orchestra of young people who were picked up from the streets to give them a home, and through music re-socialize them. And they did films for World Ocean Day for us, with messages from the ocean, and the orchestra, the kids were making the music for it, and then the ocean answers to humans that that they should be more respectful also for nature. But we are not only in we do things in Europe as well. Next slide is one typical thing. It's always World Ocean Day, or when we have Environment Festival in Brussels. We do things for very small kids, and then we do experiments also that people can have some hands-on ocean acidification, for example, or things like that, so that you can visualize it. It's not just a paper, but it's something you can really touch. And then almost the last one, is the campaign against these subsidies. Because if we do not get the subsidies phased out, the small-scale fishers cannot compete against the industrial fleets. On the other hand, those fleets cannot continue operating. 60 to 70% of their costs are fuel, because they roam over the world's ocean. Can you imagine how much fuel you need? I mean, from all perspectives, it's absurd. From CO2 emissions, the living conditions on board, slavery, lots of abuse, labor abuses, and so on. And we could have that, but we need to phase out the subsidy. So that was the lady in the traditional gown is Ngozi from she's the Secretary General of the World Trade Organization, and very much in favor. Since she is at the helm, things are moving at least a bit. So we are about now in the ratification here, and then the last picture is perhaps a few more publications and some of the people who are driving our work. Maria Fernanda is the one who is really our champion for these participatory visualization techniques and organizing those. So, stop.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk, Cornelia. And I think the last slide you showed us here, the subsidies question, that's also, I mean, on a different level, but related to that, that's a big theme in the Netherlands, and you know all about it. We have still time for questions. If you have to, because we were late, if you have to leave earlier, we just have some time now, but those who have to leave, feel free. Who wants to start? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's really, I think the work that you're doing is really interesting and important. But I can't help but wonder how do you think it's possible to target the foreign, in a sense, like large scale fisheries on like a level where you don't really participate in policy making, for example? Like, is there anything that as like students or academics we can do to kind of target that like outside part, I guess, and not the like local communities? Does that make sense?
Let's say that there is a big coalition that of civil society organizations all over the world, which work with the WTO, with the World Trade Organization, and push and do publicity and try. And every time the negotiators meet, we have events, and or in Geneva, all the trams will be plastered with WTO, all eyes on you. You need to deliver because you've had a mandate for 20 years. You are failing the world, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. And even that, what they have agreed last year is not enough. It's only the first step. They are negotiating already for a follow-up treaty. But it is, I think, this is very much, well, there is economic and social research, of course, and it is important to also show that, let's say, explain that to people who are not in fishing, because fishery as an economic sector is, of course, comparatively small. It's less than 10% of agriculture. Mm-hmm. But in terms of, for example, there was a recent study that suggested that the trawling emits as much CO2 as the entire aeronautics industry. Because imagine these giant nets that you pull in a dense medium like water. This is enormously energy intensive, and it doesn't make sense. We could use our ecological knowledge, and the fish come to us. So explaining some of that, and now it is not only, let's say, labor abuses or other things that are coming increasingly to public attention in the long distance fleets in particular, but also things like that, because I think people now start caring that we should not we should reduce our CO2. Mm-hmm. And the small scale guys, many are still with sails, or rowing, or using the currents and so on, and in any event are a lot less impactful and create more jobs. So we can try to inject that into the public debate and make people aware, so that they start asking questions and say, let's not get the lobby away with it. Mm-hmm. And just, I don't know, ring the commissioner, put pressure. And what they say, for example, in Europe, we're supporting some European small-scale fishers as well. But we have very strong pro-industry policies, mm-hmm. so that it is very hard for the small guys. They don't get quota in Europe, for example. No quota, you cannot fish and land legally. Or as a small-scale guy, you have to comply with the same requirements as the big guys. from the bureaucratic and hygiene and whatever. And, you know, it creates extra costs and gets them out of business. So I think there are various ways in which we can say, okay, as a society, do in agricultural products, we are now trying to buy local, right? So that we don't get things from all over the world, and our fruit, or, you know, why do we need to have strawberries in December? You know, so in fish, we could have, you see, in Europe, if we were managing our resources in a more prudent, in a more precautionary way, we could catch 5 million tons more than we do. We catch about 7 million tons in European waters. There is no need to go all over the Pacific. We could, if we let the fish grow instead of catching it as juveniles, as we do a lot in Europe, we could have more fish here and practice some of the principles we think are good principles, and which we try to apply in other spheres. And I think that's something you can do as a citizen, as a student. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so do you maybe have some kind of advice for scientists and the scientific community how to follow this right moral path in their research, and to influence maybe the whole community to actually acknowledge the human rights problems and the environment?
Yeah.
I know it's a broad.
No. I think you find a lot of the evidence already in the scientific literature, but ordinary people don't read the primary literature. It's also framed in ways that are hard to read, even though theoretically introduction, methods, and results and conclusion could be the flow of storytelling, but the way it is being presented is not very often very user-friendly. So translating the results into something that is more akin to storytelling, or this is why I show the pictures that you see the people, is not something anonymous. There are real people behind them. And so you can also sort of start thinking, you know, it's not just a number. These are real people's lives, and we could do better. And we don't necessarily have to throw overboard everything we do. And I think storytelling, I think if scientists would do more storytelling, I think it would help society a lot in terms of taking the measure of what's going on and looking at what alternative options do we have, and try a few out.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for this very rich talk that addressed really a complex phenomenon. We started with the Anthropocene and the climate crisis and the artificial overcommunication. Then you zoomed in on a societal issue, which could be seen in contrast, right? Fishing, but you showed that at the micro scale, through listening, change is possible, right? And this gap, the knowledge gap between what we know and how we act, is the question I have: how do we bring it back, right, to our side? Because it's our consumption that is driving the big steamers, and how do we change those practices? And you emphasize the importance of storytelling and education, and how change can be brought about also without language. Many of us work with language, but you show the power of pictures in order to bring about change, and kind of listening. And so I was wondering if you had more suggestions on that front from the point of view of teachers and educators and students on the European side, where we are very actively contributing to the Anthropocene in order to bring about a change which you don't feel directly, as the people do on the shores. We don't see that directly. I mean, yes, we do with the temperatures, of course, but it's not as immediate.
Yeah, sure.
But I was wondering if you had any suggestions.
As a matter of fact, I mean, some colleagues are already saying we should not just talk about crisis, but about how we prepare for disasters. Because that is one of the things we found in the villages as well. Because there is always something that may be unexpected or something. So if you plan ahead, and it's actually hard work to do these sausages of, you know, what is your plan? What is it actually? What can work? What is realistic? And where are the obstacles? And where are my allies or my strengths and so on? That's super important, because it requires you to take a step back, not being in your daily routine, but think through. Now, it is unlikely that everything is exactly happening as you have planned it, but if you have done that work of analysis, you will be able to cope much better with whatever else comes, because it means you have already in your mind at least partially thought, okay, you know, that, I don't know, the Mauritania will close the border for the fishing boats. So what next do we do, for example, because Senegal is fished empty and they're fishing elsewhere already. So what else do we do? Or, you know, something closer to home here, and any number of life situations. And that is, I think, also, I think for me, at least, it's a big source of hope, because it means we are not just passively drifting into something, but we can reflect, we can analyze, we can think about what can happen. And if we have thought a little bit ahead of time, and we play with different possibilities, it means whatever happens, we will be better prepared. And also to analyze a little bit, okay, what are the high risk strategies? You know, what, say, if I don't know whether I say something very heretical, but you know, the notion that you could have only electric cars, 800 million electric cars, thank you very much. I mean, it's just not going to happen. What is it? So what other options do we have? And how can we, for example, how can we make it easier for people to use public transport? You know, well, okay, but the people who are into energy consumption of people, they say, if your bus stop also is like, I think the threshold was about 700 meters. If it's more than 700 meters, you will take your car or some other transport. If it's less and the frequency is good, the chances are you will take public transport. And but this is, or I don't know, the initial opposition against pedestrian zones in the center, like everything was around cars. And then there was this example from Salzburg, I believe it was, where they had fought really up to the last drop of blood almost against the pedestrian zones, and they denounced the professor. He's a professor at Vienna University for road transport and so on, and he eventually pushed it through. And then 2 years later, the same people who had fought him, teeth and nails, rang him and said, can you please help us extend the zone? Because what happens when people walk and there is, you take your coffee, etc., they shop more. When you go by car, what you do, then you cannot have parking, etc. So in the end, less pollution, less, less stressful, and people spend more time, etc., and have better quality of life. And then they found ways around it, and I think it's that sort of things we need to test. And I don't think everything will work the same way everywhere, no? But I think the possibilities, and also the legal systems are not the same, no? One of my favorite authors, Sheila Yazanov, she's originally a lawyer, and when she studied comparatively the US system and the European system, and she was saying, there are things in the US you cannot export to Europe. They may be very good, they work there, but the institutional system is so different, it won't work. We need to find something that is adapted to conditions in Europe, and vice versa. I mean, the litigation, for example. No, in the US, lots of things will be addressed. There's political litigation. And now in the environment sphere, more and more lawyers team up with civil society organizations to try and pursue that as an additional avenue to make us rethink and change. But this is again very specific. It won't work everywhere.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat. Maybe I can sneak in my own question together with this one. So if I buy fish, I buy it from small scale fishers at the local farmers market. This could be promoted perhaps. But what you've showed us here, I mean, if we want to produce food sustainably, this would be the future. I mean, small scale fisheries that are not as destructive, that have less emissions, and yes. These are fisheries we once had in Europe. I mean, it's already changed in the early modern period, but it's very similar to medieval fishing guilds, for example, where they only also had their own measures how big a fish would be. And these were not regulations that came from governments, but these fishers organized it themselves. But so is there such a local fishery market in Europe that you go to a farmer's market and you have the right fish? And what could European small-scale fishers learn from Senegal?
Well, I don't know. The conditions are quite different. I think what works in Europe, the European Commission actually supports some initiatives by small-scale fishers in regional groupings, and they sponsor that they try different ways of organizing marketing or less impactful fishing, etc. But it's very small compared to the industrial fishing. And what would make a huge difference is if we would stop fishing juveniles. I mean, an emblematic species like cod, in the old days, cod could grow to 2 meters size. 2 meters is huge fish. You are allowed legally to land it at 35 centimeters. The fish weighs like 300 grams. There's nothing. There's not even anything to eat on them. They reproduce seriously after 65, 70 centimeters. If we were just stopping to allow landing the juveniles, it would make a big difference. And even on conditions of climate change, where we know that with warming water, there is less oxygen dissolved in the water. And so the same fish will not grow as big because there's not enough oxygen for them to grow. But if you have more big fish and a better size distribution, it means automatically also that your gene pool is a lot bigger, more diversified. So selection can act on different things. Yeah, you need to take some cookies on the
I
road.
need to catch my bike and my train, but thanks so much for your talk.
thank
Sorry,
you.
to wrap.
Bye.
Yeah. So yes, I think, but storytelling and breaking down those the scientific evidence into packages that speak to people in their and if they have a local market, fantastic. Let them measure the fish. We have this fish-based app. I can show somewhere. I have the.
Oh, yeah, let me go.
QR code, which we can.
I can also distribute it in the in the chat later.
Yeah.
For those who are interested.
And so that people get drawn to that fact. It's not that you want to go after the seller in the market, because very often it's not even the owner or something, or in the restaurant or so, no? But I think when more and more people being aware and asking questions, the message will think 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we had probably two types of apples, right? Granny Smith and Golden Delicious, and perhaps one more. And now people want diversify. So, the growers have adjusted. And I think it is not the responsibility of citizens and consumers to rectify what is bad in the market, but because that is the responsibility of the producers and especially of the administration who sets the rules. But still, I think if they realize that there is demand, you see with vegan food or other things, there is some response. So it's in the category, every little thing, every drop counts in the ocean. Yeah.
Are there more questions? Otherwise, maybe you go one last question to follow up on this. I mean, so all these steps you mentioned, just how we could change that, but they also require big political steps. I mean, it's the same for agriculture. So what you showed us here, so they I forget the exact numbers, but this small-scale fisheries creates awful lots of jobs. So there's lots of work for people. If you look at the agricultural situation in the Netherlands, for example, there are a few people working there, they are destroying a lot. But the will to employ many people in food production and to do it sustainably. So what would be the big thing? Of course, it's a huge question. But what would be the economic step or the political step to get into that direction?
I think if we were taking out the subsidies from the industrial fleets, it would stop a lot of the big vessels, number one.
Yeah.
And if we were changing some of the institutional frameworks to give privilege to small scale guys, give them quota, and they will, and at the same time have a forum where certain things get negotiated, and we set also biological or ecological limits, because too many small guys can also ruin locally, at least, the resource.
Yeah, if I may, I just find it really interesting how this kind of how food sovereignty and promoting small scale agriculture and fisheries, I think it's a really important intersection in a way, in the sense that I will go to Albert Heijn to buy salmon, for example, and I will get salmon from Chile, and then my grandparent, who is a fisher in Chile, will tell me that they cannot find salmon anymore. It's how am I here, so far away, getting food from a place where they can't even find it themselves anymore. You know, like I think this is really really interesting. Also, when you talk about like livelihoods and like if they can't rely on their environment, then that will also like provoke more emissions like in the future in a way, you know. And so I just really think this is very like interesting and like a really important thing to take into account also in climate transitions and climate justice. So yeah, I just think it's really interesting.
The Chilean aquaculture industry is, of course, this is capital from Norway.
Mm-hmm.
And the production methods are absolutely horrendous. You have death of the divers who clean the net cages and things like that. And then they also, it's an introduced species. Whichever way you look at it, it's horrendous. And besides, generally these let's say the salmon that are fattened in net cages, what you normally find in the supermarket shelves or so, has these, it's like slices of reddish meat and then white fat and then meat again, right? Now, this is typical for aquaculture because the fish cannot swim. They swim around a little bit, but the consistency of the meat is lousy. And because everything is trimmed for fast production, they overfeed them. And that is when they grow these fat layers. And fish have segmented meat muscle. It's not like us. We have connective tissue in our muscles. Fish are segmented, right? So and actually it is an indication if those segments are wide, the fish was big. If they are narrow, it was a very small fish. Mm-hmm. So that is for example, as a first indication in the restaurant, when you get a fillet and it's very narrow, you can ask. You don't mob the waiter, but you can ask. This looks like a very small fish. What do you serve me here? No, but the natural salmon will not have those fat layers. So I would not personally. I don't eat the farm stuff because. I remember in the very early days, they were using literally tons of antibiotics. Mm-hmm. At a time when it was not even understood that cold-blooded animals like fish don't have the same physiology like us warm-blooded ones, and the antibiotics were all originally designed for warm-blooded animals, and then they feed in excess so that they grow very fast. What is not eaten falls down to the ground. So they need to move the cages as well, because with all the organic matter and the pellets that they shit, the fish, the animals, you typically have dead zones. Mm-hmm. Where there is no more oxygen because the bacteria break down the organic matter. And then you can actually see that. I've seen in Chile, they did experiments and there was like a cloud downstream from the cages, everything dead. And yeah. And the people locally, yes, they can hardly afford that. Mm-hmm. So it's this whole thing is. In addition, we know the salmon have these homing instincts. In nature, they will recognize the smell of the creek or the river where they have the eggs were laid, mm-hmm. and they will go back there. But of course, when you have hundreds of thousands of fish escaping every year from, rough weather, poof, off they go. They will contaminate what little is left of the natural salmon. And the cage-grown ones or cage-fattened ones would probably not even be very resilient in nature, because they have not learned to swim as much and find the food and things like that. So this on different levels is not really the best solution, perhaps. What it does, all the aquaculture stuff allows private appropriation more easily than fisheries, because you have a common pool resource. But yeah.
So we also learned a lot about fish. Thanks so much for this breakout. And I think one of the things that stood out here. So we had in the Netherlands quite some successes with actions against subsidies in food production. I mean, in agriculture, it's basically, let's say, a very similar story, but in fisheries, these are the harmful mechanisms there. That might be the next thing to look at.
Very much so, because agriculture is also such a climate driver.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this insight you provided for us here, and
thanks for putting up with the delay.